The first time she smiled at him, she wasn't smiling for him at all. She was thanking the old widow standing beside him for a loaf of fresh bread, and the rancher simply happened to be there, holding the horse she'd nearly walked into. But somehow, that careless little smile settled inside his heart like rain falling on dry earth. His name was Luke Dawson, and for 36 years he'd believed love belonged to other people. Men like him were built for fences, cattle, and lonely sunsets. Not for happy endings. Not for gentle hands reaching across supper tables. Not for women whose laughter made every room brighter. The girl who unknowingly changed everything was named Emma Brooks. She arrived in Red Hollow one cold October morning with nothing but a faded carpetbag and a letter folded carefully inside her coat. Nobody knew much about her. Only that she'd come to care for old Mrs. Whitmore after the woman's daughter passed away. Emma wasn't loud. She didn't chase attention. She walked with quiet grace, spoke kindly to strangers, and treated every person like they mattered. Luke noticed all of it. She never noticed him. Not really. To her, he was simply the dependable rancher everyone trusted. The man who fixed broken wagons without asking for payment. The one who carried sacks of grain for elderly neighbors. The quiet giant who tipped his hat whenever she passed. Nothing more. And somehow, that hurt far more than he expected. Every Sunday after church, Luke found himself inventing reasons to stay in town. Maybe the blacksmith needed help. Maybe the general store required another delivery. Maybe someone needed a horse shod. Truthfully, he simply hoped Emma might pass by. Sometimes she did. She'd wave politely. "Morning, Mr. Dawson." He'd answer with a smile that disappeared the second she looked away. "Morning, Miss Brooks." That was enough to make his entire week feel lighter. His younger ranch hand, Ben, caught on almost immediately. "You know she doesn't know you're in love with her." Luke nearly dropped the saddle he was carrying. "I am not." Ben laughed. "You carved her initials into a fence post." Luke looked toward the pasture. "I was marking lumber. It says EB." It was inventory. Ben laughed so hard he nearly fell off the porch. Luke walked away before anyone noticed his red face. Winter settled across the valley. Snow dusted rooftops. The cattle stayed close together against the wind. Emma spent most days caring for Mrs. Whitmore, chopping firewood, sewing blankets, and helping families who had even less than she did. Luke quietly made sure she never struggled. When her roof leaked during a storm, someone repaired it overnight. When her firewood pile ran low, fresh logs mysteriously appeared. When Mrs. Whitmore's medicine became too expensive, the pharmacist announced an anonymous payment had already been made. Emma often wondered who kept helping. The town guessed it was the church. Luke never corrected them. One snowy evening she caught him leaving another stack of firewood behind the cottage. He froze. She stepped onto the porch. "Mr. Dawson?" He looked like a schoolboy caught stealing apples. "I was passing by. With enough wood for 2 weeks?" He scratched the back of his neck. "Your fence looked cold." She blinked. "My fence?" He sighed. "It sounded smarter before I said it." For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Then she laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mocking. It was warm enough to melt every inch of snow around them. "Thank you." He nodded once. "You don't have to thank me." "But I do." Their eyes met. It lasted only seconds. Yet Luke remembered that moment for years afterward. Emma watched him disappear into the falling snow. There was something painfully lonely about the way he walked. As though he expected no one to wait for him once he reached home. She suddenly wondered. Who ever took care of the man who spent his life taking care of everyone else? The question stayed with her longer than she expected. And neither of them knew. Someone else had begun watching Emma too. Someone whose intentions were nothing like Luke's. The stranger arrived before winter ended. And the moment Luke saw him tip his hat to Emma, he felt, for the very first time, what it meant to fear losing someone he'd never even had. The stranger called himself Daniel Mercer. He rode into Red Hollow on a handsome bay horse, wore polished boots that had seen more towns than trails, and smiled as though the whole world already belonged to him. People liked him quickly. He knew exactly what to say. He complimented the ladies, praised the sheriff, laughed with the ranch hands, and bought rounds of coffee at the diner. Emma thought he seemed charming. Luke thought he seemed practiced. There was a difference. The first time Luke watched Daniel walk Emma home after church, he told himself it didn't matter. She had every right to enjoy another person's company. She wasn't his. She had never been his. Still, that evening the ranch felt quieter than it ever had. Ben found him repairing the same gate for nearly an hour. "You fixed that yesterday." Luke didn't even look up. "It needs another nail." "It doesn't." Luke hammered anyway. Ben sighed. "You could always tell her." Luke stopped swinging. "And tell her what?" "The truth." Luke leaned against the fence. "The truth is she's happy." "So? So if she smiles because of another man, I won't be the reason that smile disappears." Ben shook his head. "You've got the biggest heart I've ever seen." Luke smiled sadly. Big hearts bleed easier. Spring arrived slowly. Wildflowers pushed through the earth, and the valley came alive again. Emma visited the Dawson Ranch one afternoon with a basket of fresh bread. Mrs. Whitmore had insisted she thank Luke properly for all the quiet kindnesses he'd shown during winter. Luke nearly forgot how to speak when he saw her standing outside his barn. "I thought," she said, smiling shyly, "you might be hungry." He looked at the basket. "I don't deserve all this." "I think you do." He invited her inside. The ranch house was simple. Clean floors. Old wooden furniture. A rocking chair beside the fireplace. Family photographs lined one shelf. Emma stopped in front of them. "Your parents?" Luke nodded. "They passed years ago." "And your wife?" He smiled faintly. "Never had one." She looked surprised. "I thought a man my age should have married?" Emma blushed. "I didn't mean. It's all right." He chuckled softly. "Most people assume that." She looked around again. "It must get lonely." He answered honestly. "Sometimes." There was no self-pity in his voice. Only truth. Emma noticed it. For the first time, she didn't see the dependable rancher everyone admired. She saw a man carrying years of silence by himself. Before she left, she handed him the bread. "You shouldn't always eat supper alone." Luke smiled. "I'll remember that." For days afterward, Emma found herself thinking about that empty rocking chair by his fireplace. Meanwhile, Daniel's visits became more frequent. He brought flowers. Fancy ribbons. Little gifts from neighboring towns. Everyone admired how devoted he seemed. Luke noticed something no one else did. Daniel never stayed to help when work needed doing. He disappeared whenever someone's wagon broke down. He vanished when Mrs. Whitmore became ill again. He always arrived when there was admiration to collect. One afternoon, Luke rode into town and found Emma struggling to lift heavy sacks of flour. Before he could dismount, Daniel simply tipped his hat. "I'm afraid I'd ruin this fine jacket." Luke climbed down without saying a word. He carried every sack into the bakery. Emma smiled gratefully. "You didn't have to." "I know." Daniel laughed. "Luke, you're going to spoil everyone in this town." Luke answered quietly. "Helping people isn't spoiling them." Daniel's smile faded just enough for Luke to notice. Emma noticed too. It was the first crack in the perfect image she'd built of Daniel. Weeks later, Red Hollow held its annual spring dance. Music echoed through the town square. Lanterns glowed overhead. Couples laughed beneath the stars. Luke almost didn't attend. Ben practically dragged him there. Emma arrived wearing a pale blue dress that made half the town stop talking. Daniel reached her first. "May I have the opening dance?" She smiled politely. "I'd like that." Luke watched from across the square. He didn't blame her. Why would she choose the quiet rancher standing in the shadows over the handsome traveler everyone admired? So he quietly stepped away. He was halfway to his horse when someone called his name. "Mr. Dawson." He turned. Emma stood before him, breathing quickly. "I noticed you were leaving. I didn't want to interrupt." She hesitated. "I saved the last dance." Luke stared at her. "For me?" She smiled. "If you're still here." Before he could answer, Daniel appeared behind her. His expression remained friendly. But his eyes were anything but. Luke suddenly realized something. Daniel wasn't simply interested in Emma. He saw Luke as competition. And from the way Daniel looked at him, the game had only just begun. Luke stayed. Not because he expected anything. Only because Emma had asked. He stood near the edge of the dance floor while one song faded into another. Daniel danced with Emma twice. Another young rancher asked for the third. Luke waited without complaint. Ben wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You've been standing here so long I thought you'd grown roots." Luke accepted the cup. "I gave her my word." Ben smirked. "She gave you hers first." When the fiddler announced the final song of the evening, Emma looked around the crowd. Her eyes searched until they found Luke. She walked straight toward him. "I was afraid you'd gone home." "I almost did." "I'm glad you didn't." Luke removed his hat. "I've never been much of a dancer." She smiled. "Neither have I." "Then we'll make quite a pair." The music began softly. Neither of them spoke for a while. Luke's hands trembled ever so slightly as he rested one on her waist. He hoped she wouldn't notice. She did. "You seem nervous." "I've faced stampedes that frighten me less." Emma laughed. "You make me sound terrifying." "Not terrifying." He looked into her eyes. "Important." The word lingered between them. Emma felt her heart skip in a way she hadn't expected. This quiet man, the one who never asked for attention, made her feel safer than anyone she had ever known. When the song ended, neither of them moved. "I had a lovely evening," she whispered. "So did I." Daniel watched from across the square. His jaw tightened. The next morning, gossip spread through town. Some people smiled, wondering if Red Hollow's quiet rancher had finally found someone. Others whispered that Daniel wouldn't give up so easily. They were right. A few days later, Daniel invited Emma on a picnic beside Willow Creek. She accepted, believing there was no harm in getting to know him better. The afternoon began pleasantly enough. But Daniel talked almost entirely about himself. The ranch he planned to buy. The money he expected to make. The towns where people admired him. When Emma spoke about Mrs. Whitmore or the children she helped teach on Sundays, he barely listened. Instead, he reached for her hand. "You deserve a bigger life than this little town." Emma gently pulled away. "I rather like this little town." "You'll outgrow it." "And if I don't?" He smiled, though it no longer reached his eyes. You will. Emma rode home unsettled. She couldn't explain why. Meanwhile, Luke was repairing a bridge washed out by spring rains when Ben galloped toward him. Luke! What happened? Mrs. Whitmore collapsed. Luke dropped every tool he was holding. By the time he reached the cottage, Emma was kneeling beside the old woman, fighting tears. The doctor arrived soon after. It was her heart, he said quietly. She'll need someone with her constantly. Emma looked exhausted. I'll manage. Luke answered before she could protest. No. She looked up. You've barely slept in days. I'll be fine. You won't. That evening, Luke moved a rocking chair onto the cottage porch and spent the entire night there. Whenever Emma needed water, medicine, or firewood, he was already standing. He never once complained. Near sunrise, Emma stepped outside with 2 cups of coffee. You haven't slept. Neither have you. She sat beside him. For a long moment, they watched the sunrise in silence. Then she asked the question that had been growing inside her heart for months. Luke, why are you always there whenever I need help? He looked across the fields instead of at her. Because some things become important long before they're ever yours. Emma frowned gently. I don't understand. Luke swallowed hard. He almost told her. Almost. Instead, he smiled sadly. Maybe someday you will. Before Emma could ask another question, the sound of galloping horses shattered the quiet morning. A rider came racing toward the cottage, shouting Luke's name. The Dawson Ranch was on fire. Luke didn't wait for another word. He was already on his horse before the rider finished speaking. Emma followed as far as the edge of town, her heart pounding harder with every cloud of black smoke rising into the morning sky. By the time Luke reached the ranch, flames had swallowed one side of the main barn. The horses screamed in terror. Men formed a bucket line from the creek while women carried blankets and water. Luke didn't stop to think. He ran straight into the burning barn. Luke! Ben shouted. The horses! Inside, thick smoke clawed at his lungs. The frightened animals kicked against their stalls, desperate to escape. Luke cut one rope after another, guiding each horse toward the open doors. A burning beam crashed behind him. The exit disappeared beneath flames. Outside, Emma had arrived with the others. She watched helplessly. He's still in there. Someone grabbed her arm. You can't go inside. But she had already taken a step forward. Ben held her back. He'll find a way. Minutes felt like hours. Then one terrified colt burst through the smoke. Luke came right behind it, coughing violently as the roof collapsed only seconds after he reached open ground. The crowd erupted in relief. Emma ran without thinking. She threw her arms around him. You fool. Luke froze. She was holding him. Her hands trembled against his soot-covered shirt. You could have died. They needed me. And what if they had lost you? He looked into her tear-filled eyes. No one had ever cried because they were afraid of losing him. Not like this. Before either of them could speak again, the sheriff rode into the yard. His face was grim. We found lantern oil behind the barn. The crowd fell silent. It wasn't an accident. Ben stared in disbelief. You mean someone set the fire? The sheriff nodded. We're looking for the man who bought that oil yesterday. Luke had a sinking feeling before the name was spoken. Daniel Mercer. No one could find him. He had disappeared before sunrise. Emma refused to believe it at first. There must be some mistake. But by evening another truth emerged. Daniel had borrowed money from nearly every merchant in town. He had promised investments that never existed. Even worse, he had planned to convince Emma to marry him before leaving with her small inheritance from her late parents. Every smile. Every gift. Every promise. It had all been part of a lie. Emma sat alone outside Mrs. Whitmore's cottage long after sunset. Luke quietly joined her. "I should have seen it." "No. I believed him." "You believe the good in someone." She lowered her head. "I nearly let the wrong man into my life." Luke answered gently. "That doesn't make you foolish." She looked at him. "It makes you kind." Tears finally escaped. "I've spent so much time searching for someone exciting." She laughed bitterly through her tears. "That I never noticed the man who was quietly making my life easier every single day." Luke's heart stopped. She continued before fear could silence her. "It was you." "The roof." He nodded. "The firewood." Another nod. "The medicine." He smiled faintly. "I asked the pharmacist not to tell you." Emma shook her head in disbelief. "Why?" "Because kindness isn't supposed to come with a bill." She reached for his rough, weathered hand. "And you never expected anything back?" "No. Not even me." Luke took a long breath. "I loved you long before you ever noticed me." The words hung between them. There was no grand speech. No attempt to persuade her. Only the simple truth he had carried alone for so long. Emma covered her mouth as fresh tears fell. All at once, she understood. The quiet smiles. The careful distance. The way he always appeared whenever life became difficult. He had never been waiting for a chance. He had simply been loving her the only way he knew how. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. "I noticed too late." Luke smiled softly. "No. You noticed exactly when your heart was ready." She closed her eyes. Then she kissed him. Slowly. Tenderly. As though she were thanking him for every silent act of love he had never spoken aloud. But just as hope began to bloom between them, a rider came racing into town with terrible news. Daniel Mercer had been found. And he wasn't running anymore. He was riding back to Red Hollow. With a gun. Fear settled over Red Hollow before sunrise. Families locked their doors. The sheriff gathered every able-bodied man in town. Luke loaded his rifle, though he prayed he would never need to fire it. Emma stood beside him on the porch of the ranch house. "I don't want you facing him alone." "I won't be alone." She slipped her hand into his. "You never will be again." Those words gave him more courage than any weapon. Near noon, Daniel rode into town. Dust followed him like a storm. His horse stopped in front of the sheriff's office. He looked exhausted, unshaven, and desperate. The confident smile was gone. Only anger remained. His eyes found Emma. "You belong with me." Emma stepped closer to Luke. "No. You promised me your time." "I never promised you my heart." Daniel's hand drifted toward the revolver on his belt. Before he could touch it, half the town had already raised their rifles. The sheriff spoke firmly. "It's over." For the first time, Daniel realized he stood completely alone. No friends. No admirers. No one willing to believe another lie. Slowly, he lifted his hands. The deputies took him into custody without a single shot being fired. As they led him away, Daniel looked back at Luke. "I don't understand." Luke answered quietly. "You tried to make people love you." He looked toward Emma. "I only tried to love her." Daniel lowered his head. He had no reply. Life returned to Red Hollow one peaceful day at a time. The burned barn was rebuilt. Neighbors who had lost sleep over the fire worked side by side until it stood stronger than before. Mrs. Whitmore recovered enough to sit on her porch again, smiling every time Luke and Emma visited together. One evening, months later, Luke found Emma standing beside the same fence where he had once pretended to repair imaginary nails. The sunset painted the valley in shades of gold. Emma traced her fingers across the weathered fence post. There, hidden beneath years of dust, were two faded initials. E.B. She looked at him with wide eyes. You really did carve them. Luke rubbed the back of his neck, embarrassed. I was hoping that had disappeared. She laughed through happy tears. So Ben was telling the truth. He usually does. She turned toward him. How long? Luke smiled. Since the day you thanked Mrs. Whitmore for a loaf of bread. She covered her face, laughing softly. All this time. All this time. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folding knife. Without saying a word, she carefully carved two more letters beside the first. LD. Then she stepped back. There. Luke stared at the wood. Our initials. She nodded. No more one-sided stories. He looked at her with the same quiet wonder he had carried from the very beginning. You've made the happiest man in the West. Emma slipped both hands into his. No. She smiled, her eyes shining. We made each other happy. That autumn, the entire town gathered beneath strings of lanterns outside the rebuilt barn. The same fiddler who had played at the spring dance filled the cool evening air with music once more. This time, when the first song began, Luke didn't wait in the shadows. He walked straight to Emma. May I have the first dance? She smiled exactly as she had the day they first met. Only now, that smile truly belonged to him. And every dance after that. As they swayed beneath the stars, Ben leaned toward Mrs. Whitmore and whispered, Told you she'd notice eventually. The old woman smiled knowingly. The best kind of love doesn't arrive all at once. It waits. It serves. It stays. Luke looked into Emma's eyes, remembering every lonely sunset he had once believed he would face by himself. Those sunsets no longer belonged to a lonely rancher. They belonged to two hearts that had found each other, not through grand promises or perfect timing, but through quiet acts of love that had been there from the very beginning. And as the last light disappeared beyond the endless western horizon, neither of them feared tomorrow anymore, because home had never been a place. It had always been the heart waiting patiently beside them.